In the late 1970s, inside a British department store, a customer purchased a Dynatron radiogram. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of reproduction furniture, a grand Queen Anne-style cabinet bearing a name that held royal warrants. But when the back panel was removed, the illusion collapsed. Inside was not bespoke British engineering. There was no meticulously hand-wired chassis. Instead, the cabinet hid a mass-produced standard Philips plastic circuit board. The engineers who originally built the brand were gone. The high street dealers who once proudly demonstrated its heavy tuning dials had quietly stepped away. A radio once built for embassies was now merely an empty wooden shell housing generic electronics. A few decades earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. It had been the undisputed Rolls-Royce of the British sitting room. But the real story of Dynatron is not only the story of a corporate buyout. It is the story of how the British concept of luxury wireless was hollowed out by retail logic, changing technology, and a market that preferred the appearance of heritage over the cost of true perfection. Every week, we tell the stories of British wireless makers, high street shops, and listening habits that once shaped how Britain heard the world, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In Maidenhead, in 1927. In the mid-1920s, the British wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source, was largely an instrument of compromise. The BBC, broadcasting from Savoy Hill, was rapidly expanding its reach across the country. But the devices used to capture those voices were crude. Most were utilitarian wooden or metal boxes, bristling with exposed dials, tangled aerial wire, and glowing valves. Glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before the transistor era. They were built purely for reception, not for musicality. A listener hunched over a tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was essentially a technician, coaxing a faint voice from the static. The sound that eventually emerged from early horn loudspeakers, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, was thin, tinny, and easily distorted. For the British working class, this fragile connection to London was a modern miracle. But for the wealthy, the radio presented a distinct aesthetic and auditory problem. The British sitting room of the 1920s was a sanctuary of polished mahogany, Persian rugs, and quiet domestic order. The crude, industrial-looking radio receivers of the day simply did not belong there. More importantly, the distorted audio they produced was an insult to a demographic accustomed to live orchestras and private concerts. The British market severely lacked a wireless set that could match the acoustic quality of a live performance and the physical elegance of bespoke furniture. The solution did not come from a massive industrial conglomerate, but from a garden shed in Maidenhead, Berkshire. In 1927, two teenage brothers, Ronald H. Hacker and Arthur G. Hacker, surveyed the British radio market and found it entirely inadequate. Driven by a desire to hear broadcasts with genuine tonal purity, they built a custom radio receiver for their father. They did not design to a price. They designed to an acoustic ideal. The resulting set sounded so vastly superior to anything available in high street shop windows that neighbors, friends, and local affluent listeners immediately requested their own. Realizing the commercial potential of uncompromised audio engineering, the Hacker brothers formally began production, establishing the company that would soon become known to the world as Dynatron Radio Limited. They established their early operations at the Perfecta Works on Raymead Road in Maidenhead. From this modest British setting, they forged a philosophy that defied every convention of mass-market manufacturing. While other companies sought to reduce the number of expensive valves To keep retail prices down, the hackers used as many as necessary to guarantee flawless selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, and immense volume without a trace of distortion. The hacker brothers understood that their creations were not merely electronic devices, they were acoustic instruments. To house their complex, hand-wired chassis, they commissioned master cabinet makers to construct heavy, acoustically deadened wooden enclosures finished in rich veneers. This transformed the radio from a piece of scientific apparatus into a grand piece of domestic furniture. But this absolute refusal to compromise carried a staggering financial cost. In the early 1930s, while a standard mass-produced British family radio might cost between $10 and $15, a flagship Dynatron radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, commanded prices that were almost incomprehensible to the average citizen. A top-tier Dynatron model could cost upwards of 130 guineas. To put that into perspective, in an era where the average British working wage was barely $3 a week, a Dynatron cost more than a small motor car. It was not a casual purchase, it was an estate investment. Because of this immense price tag, Dynatron could not be sold through ordinary local radio shops or high-street electrical dealers. The hacker brothers bypassed the standard retail infrastructure entirely. They forged relationships with the most exclusive department stores in the country, placing their units on the polished showroom floors of Harrods and the Army and Navy stores in London. The strategy was audacious, but it worked flawlessly. The British upper classes, diplomats, and aristocrats, who had previously dismissed the wireless as a noisy, working-class novelty, suddenly had a brand engineered specifically for their sensibilities. Early reviews in enthusiast publications like Wireless World marveled at the sheer engineering excess of the Dynatron chassis. When the brothers introduced their legendary Ether Emperor in the mid-1930s, it featured a massive multi-valve tuner and an amplifier capable of moving air with a depth and clarity that rivaled a live concert hall. For the first time, a British radio brand had successfully separated the concept of listening from the act of technical tinkering. The wealthy did not have to understand how a tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, functioned. They only had to turn a smoothly weighted, illuminated dial, sit back in a leather armchair, and let the BBC wash over the sitting room in perfect fidelity. The hacker brothers had not just filled a gap in the British market. They had invented the concept of British luxury wireless. The defining breakthrough for Dynatron did not arrive as a sudden mass-market fad, but as a deliberate masterclass in electronic engineering. By the late 1930s, the hacker brothers released a machine that would cement their reputation as the absolute pinnacle of the British radio industry: the Dynatron Ether Emperor. To understand the impact of the Ether Emperor, one must understand how physically imposing it was. This was not a modest table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. It was a monumental radiogram, standing as a grand piece of domestic architecture. When a listener approached the cabinet, they were met with flawless burr walnut veneer, hand-polished to a mirror finish by master craftsmen. Lifting the heavy wooden lid revealed an interface that looked more like the dashboard of a luxury motor car than a household appliance. At the center sat an expansive, glass-covered tuning dial. The controls beneath it were machined from solid brass and heavily damped, ensuring that the volume control, the knob or slider that changes the loudness of the sound, turned with a slow, deliberate physical resistance. There was nothing lightweight or hollow about a Dynatron. The main electronic chassis alone, constructed from thick steel to prevent acoustic vibration, was so heavy that it required two strong men simply to lift it onto a local service bench. The true breakthrough, however, lay hidden beneath the wood and steel. A standard British family radio of the era typically relied on 3 or 4 valves to perform all the necessary tasks of tuning, amplification, and power regulation. The Hacker brothers considered this a miserable compromise. The Ether Emperor radiogram utilized a staggering 18 valves. This immense electronic complexity provided unparalleled sensitivity. How well a radio picks up weak signals, and allowed the receiver to pull distant stations from the air with astonishing clarity. When tuned to the BBC national program on long wave, a lower-frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception, the signal was processed through multiple stages of tuned circuits. This virtually eliminated interference. Unwanted noise or disturbance added to the signal, ensuring a silent, velvet background behind the broadcast voice. Furthermore, the audio amplification stage of the Ether Emperor was decades ahead of its time. The Hacker brothers understood that capturing a clean radio signal was pointless if the loudspeaker could not faithfully reproduce it. They fitted massive, high-fidelity drivers capable of moving vast quantities of air without distortion. The user could adjust the tone control, the control that changes the balance of bass and treble, to perfectly match the heavy acoustics of their specific drawing room. A symphony broadcast from Broadcasting House did not sound like it was being squeezed through a cardboard tube. It sounded as though the orchestra were physically present in the room. This level of uncompromising engineering created a formidable British radio moat. Competitors like EKSO, Murphy, and Pi built excellent, reliable sets for the middle classes, but they operated on the brutal logic of mass production. They had to count every penny, every valve, and every inch of copper wire to keep their retail prices viable for the high street. Dynatron simply refused to play that game. They built the perfect radio first and calculated the price afterwards. Consequently, the retail price was astronomical. In 1938, a top-tier Dynatron radiogram cost up to 150 guineas. In an era when a brand-new, semi-detached house in the British suburbs could be purchased for $350 and a respectable Austin motor car cost $130, buying a Dynatron was an extraordinary statement of wealth. A buyer was effectively paying the price of a motor vehicle for the privilege of listening to the wireless in perfect fidelity. Because of this immense cost, the Hacker brothers achieved a breakthrough in distribution that bypassed the standard retail model entirely. A customer could not simply walk into a standard high-street electrical shop in a provincial town and buy an Ether Emperor. Dynatron tightly controlled their dealer network, franchising only to the most exclusive retailers in the country. Their sets were proudly displayed on the polished showroom floors of Harrods in Knightsbridge, Fortnum and Mason, the Army and Navy stores in Victoria, high-end furniture showrooms in Mayfair, and specialist acoustic dealers in wealthy enclaves like Bath and Edinburgh. This deliberate scarcity meant that Dynatron did not compete with mass-market brands. It existed in a completely separate stratosphere of British commerce. This relentless pursuit of perfection soon attracted the ultimate institutional endorsement. The British royal family, desiring wireless sets that matched the grandeur of their residences, became devoted clients. Dynatron was officially granted a royal warrant, supplying bespoke radio equipment to King George VI. The brand quickly became the default choice for British embassies across the globe. Diplomats stationed in distant capitals required receivers with exceptional shortwave capability. A broadcast band that can carry signals over long distances, often across countries and continents. A bespoke Dynatron receiver could pull the BBC Empire service out of the atmospheric crackle in Cairo, or New Delhi with the same commanding authority it possessed in a London townhouse. For the elite listeners who could afford them, these machines were a revelation. From wealthy industrialists in Yorkshire to diplomats serving overseas, the Hacker brothers had proven that a wireless set did not have to be a technical compromise. It could be a flawless acoustic instrument. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. When peacetime returned to Britain in 1945, the domestic radio market was largely defined by austerity. While massive industrial conglomerates like EKCO and Pi scrambled to produce affordable compact table radios in cheap bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive, the Hacker brothers refused to dilute their brand. Instead of cutting costs, they expanded their ambitions. They moved operations to a larger facility at Furs Platt in Maidenhead, dedicating their assembly lines entirely to bespoke, high-fidelity wireless sets and radiograms. By the early 1950s, Dynatron had reached its absolute zenith. It was no longer just a luxury product. It had become an institutional symbol of British prestige. The Perfecta Works at Furs Platt did not operate like a standard mass-market radio factory. There were no rushing assembly lines churning out thousands of identical cheap plastic sets. Instead, the facility functioned more like a scientific laboratory merged with a master carpenter's workshop. Every tuning capacitor, every resistor, a component that limits or controls the flow of electrical current, and every massive iron core transformer was tested individually before being meticulously hand-soldered into a heavy steel chassis. The Hacker brothers personally oversaw quality control, refusing to allow a single unit to leave Maidenhead if the audio displayed even a fraction of a percent of distortion. The company's post-war flagship, the Ether Conqueror, was a towering achievement of electrical and acoustic engineering. It was a massive radiogram housed in a bespoke, hand-polished burr walnut cabinet that often required two men just to safely maneuver it into a sitting room. At a time when the average British industrial wage was roughly £8 a week, an Ether Conqueror could cost upwards of 300 guineas. To put that staggering figure into perspective, purchasing this specific radiogram required the same financial commitment as buying a small house in the British provinces or a luxury sports car. Because of this immense exclusivity, Dynatron sets were almost never seen in ordinary high-street electrical shops. They were commissioned objects. To see an Ether Conqueror on display, a customer had to visit the most hallowed retail floors in the country. They were proudly showcased at Harrods in Knightsbridge, Fortnum and Mason in Piccadilly, Kendall Milne in Manchester, and Jenner's in Edinburgh. The Hacker brothers knew exactly who they were building for, and they controlled their dealer network with absolute authority. When the heavy wooden lid of the radiogram was lifted, the listener was presented with an intricate glowing tuning dial and heavily machined brass controls. Tuning into the BBC Third Programme, a cultural broadcast service dedicated to classical music and serious drama, was not a casual act. It was a deliberate domestic event. The broadcast signal, transmitted from the towering Droitwich transmitter, a critical piece of broadcast infrastructure carrying long-wave and medium-wave national services across the country, was captured flawlessly by the Ether Conqueror's highly sensitive aerial circuit. The audio was then processed through an uncompromising bank of glass valves, feeding into massive loudspeakers that filled the room with a warm, breathtakingly clear sound. The heavy wooden cabinet, acoustically dampened to prevent any unwanted resonance, ensured that a BBC symphony broadcast sounded remarkably close to a live performance. This was the British cultural peak of the brand. A Dynatron in the sitting room was not just a radio. It was a physical manifestation of an era when Britain believed its engineering was unmatched, and a wealthy household would pay whatever it cost to hear that perfection. The brand's dominance in this elite stratosphere was absolute. The royal warrants, first granted by King George VI, were proudly renewed by Queen Elizabeth II in 1952. Dynatron radiograms were specially installed on the Royal Yacht Britannia to provide flawless global reception at sea. They were placed in the grand drawing rooms of British embassies in Paris, Washington, and New Delhi, serving as physical ambassadors of British technical supremacy. When foreign diplomats or visiting dignitaries listened to a shortwave broadcast from London, the voice almost always emerged from a Dynatron grill, the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet. In the domestic sphere, the presence of a Dynatron radiogram defined a very specific type of British sitting room. It was not the chaotic, busy environment of the family kitchen, where a small, plastic, portable radio, a radio designed to be moved from room to room or taken outdoors, might be cheerfully buzzing with the latest popular tunes on the light program. The room that housed a Dynatron was a place of quiet, formal, and deliberate listening. The cabinet itself, often finished in matching Queen Anne, Sheraton, or Chippendale reproduction styles, was treated with the exact same reverence as a grand piano or a prized antique sideboard. When a record was played, the radiogram utilized heavy, perfectly balanced tone arms and precision turntables. This ensured that the fragile grooves of a classical vinyl record were not destroyed by the heavy tracking force common to cheaper, mass-market record players sold in standard high-street shops. The audio amplification stage, glowing with intense heat from the large glass valves, delivered a bass response that could physically shake the floorboards, yet the treble remained entirely controlled and articulate. A listener could sit in a wingback chair, adjust the heavy brass tone controls, and experience a full symphony orchestra with a spatial depth that seemed physically impossible to conjure from a single piece of furniture. A Dynatron tuning dial was essentially a glowing glass map of the world. It listed distant transmitters in Hilversum, Kalundborg, and Athlone, and its shortwave bands pulled in voices from across oceans with startling clarity. Families gathered around these massive cabinets to hear the Queen's Christmas message or vital BBC news bulletins, the voices possessing a resonance and gravity that smaller sets completely failed to capture. To own a Dynatron in the 1950s and early 1960s was to possess an object of absolute permanence. A standard table radio might last 5 to 7 years before its cheap capacitors, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, dried out, its tuning cord snapped, or its bakelite cabinet cracked under the heat of its own valves. A Dynatron was built with the explicit intention of outlasting its owner. The service network, the shops, engineers, and repair counters that kept radios working after sale, was equally bespoke and uncompromising. If an Ether Conqueror or an Ether Prince radiogram required maintenance, it was rarely dragged down to a dusty corner repair shop. Instead, a factory-trained service engineer, often dispatched directly from the local premium dealer or even the Maidenhead factory itself, would arrive quietly at the house to recalibrate the complex tuning mechanism, realign the aerial circuit, or carefully replace a deteriorating valve. The sheer scale of this operation peaked in the mid-1950s. The Firze Platt factory employed hundreds of highly skilled technicians, cabinet makers, polishers, and acoustic engineers, operating at full capacity to meet the demands of the British upper classes. Their product catalogues were printed on thick, embossed paper, resembling the glossy brochures of luxury motor cars, rather than the flimsy leaflets associated with domestic electronics. The brand also expanded its range to include television sets, applying the exact same philosophy of immense, over-engineered chassis design and bespoke wooden cabinetry. A Dynatron television, boasting superior picture stability and vastly better sound than its rivals, was often double or triple the price of a standard mass-market model. It was marketed strictly to viewers who wanted to watch the BBC television service without compromising the aesthetic dignity of their home with an ugly, utilitarian box of wires. For Ronald and Arthur Hacker, this period represented the ultimate vindication of their original Maidenhead shed philosophy. They had proved beyond all doubt that a significant segment of the British market did not want a radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, to be treated as a cheap, disposable commodity. They wanted a masterpiece, and they were willing to pay whatever the Hacker brothers deemed necessary to construct it. In these peak years, Dynatron stood alone as an island of uncompromising quality. It was a brand entirely insulated from the frantic price wars of the high street. But this golden era of bespoke British manufacturing was balanced on a precarious economic precipice. The very things that made a Dynatron magnificent, the massive valve counts, the heavy steel chassis, the intensive hand-soldered point-to-point wiring, and the master-crafted wooden cabinets, were structurally opposed to the direction the global electronics industry was rapidly moving. The British market was about to undergo a violent shift from a culture of domestic permanence to an era of portability, aggressive cost-cutting, and plastic mass production. And when that relentless shift finally arrived, the heavy, beautiful, immensely expensive radiogram, sitting proudly on the sitting room floor, would find itself with nowhere left to stand. The British radio market of the mid-1950s was rapidly becoming a structurally hostile environment for bespoke, low-volume manufacturing. This was the brutal reality of the first major market force, the escalating costs of British cabinets, valves, components, and skilled labor. Every single unit that left the Furs Platt factory in Maidenhead required dozens of hours of intensive manual work. The massive iron core transformers had to be meticulously hand-wound. The complex tuning mechanisms had to be carefully calibrated by expert technicians. The heavy burr walnut cabinets required master carpenters and polishers. As post-war wages rose and raw materials became significantly more expensive, the foundational mathematics of the Dynatron business model began to fracture. Furthermore, successive government interventions, specifically steep purchase tax rates levied on luxury electronic goods, artificially inflated the already astronomical retail prices. A Dynatron radiogram was no longer just highly expensive. It was becoming economically unviable to produce and sell at any meaningful scale. The broader British market was enthusiastically embracing smaller, cheaper, and lighter table radios. But Dynatron's entire identity was anchored in heavy, uncompromising grandeur. The definitive British turning point arrived in 1954. Facing relentless financial pressure and the sheer systemic exhaustion of fighting a mass-market tide with boutique manufacturing methods, the Hacker brothers made a fateful decision. Dynatron Radio Ltd was sold to EK Co. Ltd. This acquisition fundamentally altered the trajectory of the brand. EK Co., based in Southend-on-Sea, was an immensely successful and brilliant British wireless manufacturer, famous for its striking circular bakelite cabinets and massive industrial output. But its corporate DNA was fundamentally different. EKCO was built on high-volume production, retail efficiency, and strict cost control. Dynatron was built on acoustic obsession. For a brief transitional period, RH and AG Hacker remained as joint managing directors, attempting to preserve their Maidenhead standards within this new, larger corporate structure. But the friction between absolute engineering perfection and corporate profit margins was inevitable. The boardrooms in Southend-on-Sea did not view radio receivers with the same romantic acoustic idealism as the men who had built them in a garden shed. By 1959, recognizing that the era of uncompromised cost-no-object wireless production was over under corporate ownership, the Hacker brothers resigned from the company they had founded 32 years earlier. They would subsequently establish Hacker Radio Ltd., taking their fierce dedication to quality into the new transistor radio market. But the original Dynatron company was now entirely severed from its creators. The brand was now a corporate subsidiary, and the ground beneath it was shifting rapidly. In 1960, the British electronics industry underwent a massive wave of consolidation, and Ecasio was absorbed by Pi, the sprawling Cambridge-based radio and television giant. Almost overnight, Dynatron, once a fiercely independent Maidenhead institution that answered only to the ear of its founders, became merely the prestige badge within a massive, multi-tiered industrial conglomerate. Simultaneously, the brand faced the crushing reality of the fifth British radio market force, a profound technological and listening culture shift. The massive all-in-one radiogram, which had been Dynatron's defining masterpiece, began to face an existential threat from the very audiophiles who had once championed it. The late 1950s and early 1960s saw the commercial introduction of stereophonic vinyl records. True stereo reproduction required physical separation between the left and right loudspeakers to create a realistic soundstage across the sitting room. Acoustic engineers and serious listeners argued, correctly, that housing a delicate record turntable in the exact same wooden cabinet as heavy vibrating loudspeakers created unwanted acoustic resonance and severely compromised the audio fidelity. The new standard for absolute audio perfection was the hi-fi separate, a system where the radio tuner, the amplifier, and the record deck were purchased as individual electronic units and connected via cables to freestanding loudspeakers placed in the corners of the room. The wealthy buyers, diplomats, and classical music enthusiasts who would have eagerly commissioned an Ether Conqueror radiogram in 1950 were, by 1965, turning away from grand furniture. They were purchasing specialist British separates from brands like Quad and Leak, or looking toward a new wave of highly engineered imported Japanese amplifiers. The high street premium dealers who had proudly dedicated massive floor space to Dynatron furniture found these heavy cabinets increasingly difficult to sell to the true audiophile market. The radiogram was slowly transitioning in the public consciousness from an acoustic marvel into a grand, slightly old-fashioned piece of domestic furniture. To survive, the corporate owners of the Dynatron name had to make a choice: compete in the hyper-technical hi-fi separates market, or lean heavily into the furniture aspect of the brand. Pi chose the latter, setting the stage for one of the most tragic brand dilutions in British consumer electronics history. Throughout the late 1960s, the Dynatron badge was fundamentally repurposed. Under the ownership of the Pi Group, the board of directors made a calculated, deeply cynical decision regarding the British domestic audio market. Since they could no longer compete with specialist British audio companies on pure acoustic engineering, they would compete entirely on cabinetry. The electronics inside the radiogram became entirely secondary to the veneer on the outside. Dynatron transitioned from being an electronics company that built beautiful cabinets into a furniture company that happened to install radios inside them. This strategy temporarily sustained the brand, but it alienated their core listener base. The serious wireless enthusiast who read Wireless World and understood the vital importance of a heavy mains transformer and a finely tuned aerial circuit quickly realized what was happening. A 1968 Dynatron was essentially standard Pi table radio circuitry, stretched and repackaged into a massive wooden console. The bespoke magic of the Furs Platt era was evaporating, replaced by the cold logic of shared corporate components. Then came the final, fatal blow. In 1976, the giant Dutch multinational Philips took full control of the struggling Pi conglomerate, automatically absorbing Dynatron in the process. For Philips, Dynatron was not a sacred engineering legacy to be protected and nurtured. It was merely a convenient heritage badge. It was a highly useful tool to sell premium-priced mass-market electronics to a specific conservative demographic of the British public who still associated the name with pre-war luxury. This period represents one of the most severe and depressing examples of brand dilution. The weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity. In British radio history, a Dynatron radiogram from the late 1970s was a masterpiece of domestic illusion. The cabinets were styled as imitation antique furniture, aggressively marketed as period reproduction. They featured fake Queen Anne legs, faux drawers that did not open, and highly polished, purely decorative brass handles. They looked perfectly at home in a traditional, mildly nostalgic British country house or a suburban sitting room aspiring to grandeur. But lifting the heavy wooden lid revealed a shocking betrayal of everything the Hacker brothers had originally stood for. Gone were the massive, acoustically deadened steel chassis, the 18 glowing glass valves, and the obsessive, hand-soldered point-to-point wiring. In their place sat standard, incredibly lightweight Philips printed circuit boards, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, stamped out by the thousands in massive, automated overseas factories. The tactile experience of tuning the radio was entirely ruined. The heavy, damped brass tuning dials that once felt like the controls of a luxury motor car were replaced by cheap, hollow plastic knobs, painted silver to mimic metal, which often wobbled on their spindles. The bespoke, heavy platter turntables were swapped for lightweight, standard-issue plastic record decks that skipped if someone walked too heavily across the sitting room floor. By the end of the decade, they even began awkwardly integrating cheap plastic cassette decks into the reproduction mahogany. The massive loudspeaker drivers, once capable of moving immense volumes of air without the slightest hint of distortion, were replaced by generic, off-the-shelf paper cones. The audio they produced was flat, lifeless, and entirely unremarkable. The customer was no longer buying a precision acoustic instrument. They were buying an empty wooden box that happened to contain the exact same generic radio receiver found in a cheap plastic kitchen radio. The British market ruthlessly exposed this contradiction. This was the crushing reality of the fourth market force: imported, good enough listening. The true British audiophiles, the exact demographic that had once revered the ether conqueror, had completely abandoned the brand. If a serious listener in 1978 wanted high-fidelity audio, they bypassed the department store furniture floor entirely. They went to a specialist hi-fi dealer on the high street and bought a sleek, silver-faced Japanese amplifier from Pioneer, Technics, or Sony. They paired it with a highly engineered standalone radio tuner and British bookshelf loudspeakers from brands like Key F or Bowers & Wilkins. These imported separates offered vastly superior sound, absolute reliability, and a clean, modern aesthetic for a fraction of the cost of a wooden Dynatron console. Simultaneously, the third market force, high street retail pressure, squeezed the brand out of existence. The landscape of British consumer electronics was rapidly changing. The rise of discount electrical warehouses like Comet and the dominance of the Argos catalog meant that consumers expected electronics to be cheap, modern, and easily replaceable. Dynatron was left stranded in a shrinking retail demographic. They were trying to sell highly expensive, mock-antique radiograms to an aging population of buyers who valued the appearance of heritage over the reality of the sound. The exclusive high-street electrical shops and premium department stores, which had once treated Dynatron as the crown jewel of their showrooms, quietly began to drop the brand. The massive reproduction cabinets took up too much valuable floor space, generated too little profit, and appealed to too few modern customers. The bespoke service network also collapsed. There were no more factory-trained Maidenhead engineers arriving at grand houses in smart suits to carefully recalibrate a complex tuning capacitor. When a 1970s Philips-era Dynatron failed, a standard local television repairman simply unscrewed the back panel, unclipped the generic plastic circuit board, threw it in the bin, and snapped a new one into place. The radio had lost its soul, its engineering integrity, and finally, its market relevance. By the early 1980s, the concept of the grand domestic radiogram was entirely dead. The British sitting room had been thoroughly conquered by the color television set, which now occupied the prime corner of the room, and the compact modular stereo system. Recognizing that the reproduction furniture market had evaporated completely, Philips quietly discontinued the Dynatron name, closing the final chapters of production and dissolving the brand into the corporate ether. The name that had once commanded the absolute respect of the British elite, the brand that had proudly held royal warrants and furnished embassies around the globe, was simply discarded when it was no longer useful for shifting hollow wooden cabinets. The transition was complete. The premium dealers withdrew. The older customers vanished. The royal warrants disappeared. The original factories closed. The badge lost its meaning. The cheap plastics broke. The wooden cabinets emptied. The grand radiogram died. The sitting room went quiet. The death of the Dynatron brand was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, corporate erasure. When the reproduction furniture market finally collapsed in the early 1980s, Philips simply stopped applying the badge to its wooden cabinets. There was no grand rescue. There was no passionate campaign to save the name. Unlike Robert's Radio, which successfully navigated the transition to DAB, digital audio broadcasting, a digital radio system that replaces a continuous analog signal with digital data, by leaning into genuine portable design nostalgia, Dynatron was simply packed away. The corporate owners recognized that the name had been stretched too far and diluted too heavily to mean anything to a modern consumer. The brand was quietly discontinued, fading into the archives of British consumer electronics. However, the legacy of Dynatron did not completely disappear. Instead, it fractured violently into two completely different afterlives. Today, within the British preservation and vintage enthusiast community, the name provokes a fierce, almost completely divided reaction. On platforms like eBay, Gumtree, Facebook Marketplace, and the bustling tables of vintage radio fairs organized by the British Vintage Wireless Society, a bizarre market dichotomy exists. If a seller lists a 1978 Philips-era Dynatron radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, it is almost completely ignored by serious collectors. These massive, mock-antique reproduction cabinets are routinely sold for pennies. Frequently, they are purchased by upcyclers who immediately rip out the cheap plastic turntables and hollow-printed circuit boards, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, to convert the wooden shell into a gin bar or a shoe cupboard. The electronics, having possessed no inherent value when they were built, are simply thrown into the local recycling center. Conversely, the survival of the original pre-1954 Maidenhead models tells an entirely different story. A surviving Hacker-era Ether Emperor or Ether Conqueror chassis, even if it is rusted, missing its cabinet, and covered in decades of dust, will spark intense bidding wars among serious radio collectors and restoration experts. The enthusiast community treats these early machines with absolute reverence. On crowded repair benches across the country, technicians spend hundreds of hours carefully replacing dried-out capacitors, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, and sourcing rare glass valves. These original machines still matter, and they matter for a very specific functional reason. An early Dynatron valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, demands a relationship with the listener. It requires patience to let the heavy valves warm up. It requires physical effort to turn the heavily damped, solid brass tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to. It asks the listener to actively participate in the act of finding a broadcast. An old British radio with a repaired capacitor, a cleaned dial, and a massive loudspeaker still moving air can do something a smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands and online services, simply cannot do. It makes listening feel attached to a physical, deliberate process. Not because it is old, but because the uncompromising engineering still asks the listener to meet the signal halfway. Today, the physical sites where this perfection was once forged have long since surrendered to modern British development. At Ray Mead Road and Furs Plat in Maidenhead, the locations of the original Perfecta works, there are no grand monuments to the golden age of British acoustic engineering. The heavy machinery, the master carpenters, and the testing laboratories have been entirely replaced by ordinary residential developments, quiet streets, and light industrial units. The roar of the bespoke manufacturing lines has been silenced, leaving no visible trace of the empire that once supplied the grandest sitting rooms in the country. Yet, there is a final, surprising footnote to the Dynatron story that completely reframes the tragedy of the brand. When R.H. and A.G. Hacker walked away from their own company in 1959, disgusted by the corporate shift toward cheap mass production, their careers in British audio did not end. They immediately established Hacker Radio Limited. In the 1960s, while the Dynatron name was being applied to increasingly hollow wooden furniture, the Hacker brothers focused entirely on building the finest portable transistor radios that use small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making them lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly in the world. Models like the Hacker Sovereign and the Hacker Herald became legendary for their immense audio quality. Astoundingly, the brothers were awarded royal warrants a second time under their new name, proving unequivocally that their original philosophy of uncompromised engineering was correct, even in the portable era. The long arc of the Dynatron name reveals a harsh truth about how Britain builds, sells, remembers, and discards its industrial achievements. It highlights the vast, tragic gap between what the British market claims to value, honest engineering, absolute reliability, and trusted domestic permanence, and what the retail system actually rewards, cheap convenience, brand licensing, and the superficial appearance of heritage. The market proved that it was entirely willing to keep the polished wooden veneer, so long as it could quietly discard the expensive engineering hidden inside. But, in quiet corners of the country, the true legacy survives. Somewhere, sitting heavily in the corner of a British sitting room, an original 1930s Dynatron valve radiogram rests in the shadows. Its burr walnut cabinet still holds a deep, flawless polish. Its massive glass valves sit patiently in the cold. and its heavy glass dial remains dark, waiting for a hand to turn the brass knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next video.